Dr. Doom recreates the Fantastic Four, although admittedly, it's not the exact Fantastic Four. It's really more the UFOs that he created, which was a group from the Incredible Hulk issue number 254 back in the main Marvel Universe, and basically was an attempt to duplicate the Fantastic Four. But you guys will see what I'm talking about as we get through this video. Now, this is told from 3 different perspectives, and it can be a little jarring, but fortunately, you have me to make sense out of it. So these 3 perspectives are Dr. Doom talking to Tony Stark. It's Dr. Doom basically leading something called Project 4, and then it's Dr. Doom reflecting on his own past. And so if you guys recall the video that we did, where we got the origin of Dr. Doom, that he was Reed Richards, he was supposed to be a leader of the Fantastic Four, the Makers showed up in this universe, and then basically twisted him, broke his mind, and turned him into Doom, that what he does is reflecting on his own past, we get that little bit of an origin here, right? Where the question's asked of the class, what is the 4th dimension? Can anyone tell me? And of course, Reed Richards raises his hand. And that's when you switch to the Project 4 perspective, where he simply just says, a prison. Time closes in on us like the walls of a cell. If you are to make it past those walls, escape this prison that you were born into, you'll have to think in 4 dimensions. I am Doom, and I will be your teacher. And then you switch to the next perspective, the one that's basically happening in the here and now, which is where he's talking to Tony. And he just asks him, right, like, do you have time to speak? Now, one of the things to know about Tony Stark in the new Ultimate Universe is that if you guys recall the video that we did, where basically the Ultimates were tricked into arriving at a facility where they thought they were liberating a bunch of captured superheroes, only to discover they had been lured into a trap and were ambushed by the Incredible Hulk and his immortal weapons, Tony Stark was basically dead. Right? Like he was an inch away from dying, and Dr. Doom saved him, but Tony Stark realized him going out into the conflict like that is a massive danger, because while the Ultimates is designed to kind of be self-sufficient to a degree, it kind of requires Tony Stark to at least operate as the brains behind the operation. And so without Tony Stark, it would seemingly all fall apart, to say nothing of the fact that he has a very personal motivation in organizing a team that's designed to basically destroy the Maker. And so in response to that, he created what you and I might call his own version of Doombots, right? Basically beings that go out there and fight in his stead. And so again, that's when you jump to this little bit of a flashback. Now, the cool thing about the flashback moments, I don't necessarily say that they're necessary, but they are awesome because they show us how Reed's life could have unfolded had the Maker not shown up, or at least allows us to imagine it. Case in point, when he's hanging out with Ben Grimm, right? That Ben is just kind of like, look, you're 14, Reed. And Reed's like, look, I'm a doctor. I have 3 PhDs. I think I can handle a little bit of alcohol. And Ben's just like, all right, well then here you go. And what happens? Reed starts puking his guts up because he can't handle his liquor. Right? And Ben is just like, you'll be all right, right? I got you, Dr. Richards. Like, I'm sure your PhDs will come in handy now, right? It's little moments like that that are so cool and they're so personal, right? For the way that Doom is shown in this reality. And so jumping back to Project 4, right? That where he talks about being their teacher, one of the students raises their hand. They say, how is this different from the Avengers program that we were already selected for? And the response of Doom, right, is number 1, he doesn't want to be addressed as Dr. Doom, simply just as Doom. And then he says, this project predates the Avengers program. Development was slow to start. It is the result of years of research into cosmic energy and a new theory of superhuman organization. And that's why he says, welcome to Project 4. And so when you jump to the conversation between himself and Tony, Tony asks him, is your question about Project 4? And Doom simply says, no, right? He says, Project 4 continues on pace. I recently discovered something, potentially vital information, and I felt that you had to know. Of course, again, Tony kind of being distracted here, but you get how this is going, right? The pattern that it's following. Flashback, Project 4, Tony Stark. So it's kind of cool, right? Then it just goes in this pattern over and over and over again. That's why I say it starts off a little jarring, but then once you get the rhythm of it, it all makes sense. So when you jump to the flashback, it's Reed Richards talking to Susan Storm. And he says, cosmic rays are the leftover energies of the Big Bang, the universal creative impulse made manifest. If we could harness this power, we could do anything. It's not a stretch to say that we could put an end to disease, scarcity, even death, Susan. And so that's kind of how it all started, right? That it wasn't really the Fantastic Four's desire to go into space and explore cosmic rays because they were essentially a part of the space race and so on and so forth. It was trying to find a way to make the world better. How can we use cosmic energies to usher humanity into its next stage, to turn Earth into a utopia? But as we also know, because of the fact that the Maker had screwed with the calculations of Reed Richards and basically thrown everything off, essentially destroying the mission, that when the Fantastic Four went into space and they were hit with cosmic rays, Johnny Storm burst into flames, he died. Ben Grimm was seemingly pushed off of a mountaintop and he was killed because he hadn't really been transformed into the Thing. And then Susan Storm, she died of cancer. And that's the craziness of it all, is because like that, Reed Richards literally watched his entire life fall apart. And so that's when you switch to Project 4. And he says, thanks to Miss Chavez, each of you will be bombarded with cosmic rays in short controlled bursts. The levels must be exactly right. Too much or too little destroys human cells. Death is creative and painful. And he says, my analysis says you are all likely to survive exposure, but not certainly. And I am not the Maker. Do you understand what that means? You have a choice. Each of you has a choice here. You can walk away, which was not a choice given to Reed, right? And that's one of the crazy things, is because when you switch over to his conversation with Tony, right, like Dr. Doom simply says, I am Doom and that is all I will ever be. But before I was Doom, my name was Reed Richards. And so jumping back to this flashback, right, between himself and Susan, that it shows that a romance was blossoming, love was beginning to form between the two of them, right? That Susan was falling in love with Reed's intelligence, his personality, his desire to make the world better, and Reed was falling in love with Susan because who wouldn't, right? She was absolutely gorgeous, right? And so that's when you get to Project 4, and he says you'll be formed into surgical teams, small, scientifically balanced units of 4. Thanks to the Immortus Engine, we will have relative years to train, right? Of course, the Immortus Engine basically being a time travel device. And so one of the things that we end up learning here is that in the origin story that we saw for Doom, he was constantly experimenting on rats, trying to basically bestow on them the powers of the Fantastic Four, the hope being that he could somehow restore the Fantastic Four, presumably by taking the Immortus Engine, jumping back into the past, figuring out what it was the Maker changed, correcting that, and then making sure that they gained the powers that they were supposed to get. That seemed to be his modus operandi, but he's learned something. He says in another universe, Reed Richards is Mr. Fantastic, leader of the Fantastic Four, a great hero, of course referring to Earth 616. And where Tony tells him, right, you have to stop dwelling on the past, Doom, we're looking to the future now, and Mr. Fantastic kind of sounds like a piece of work if he has a name like that, we jump to yet another flashback, right? And again, it's the team coming together, where Ben says, like, you're a real piece of work, you know that, Reed? And he's like, I do. That's why it has to be us. You're the only 3 people on the planet that can put up with me, which is kind of a funny thing. But notice this, throughout these flashbacks, when Doom is looking back at his own story, there's this kind of silhouette of white individuals that are standing around him, right? They don't really have any physical form per se, outside of just a shape of a person, and that's basically it. That will become important, and it will be a talking point here in a little while. But when you jump to Project 4, it's Doom training them, right? And he says, change shape and density. Your new forms can interact in myriad and surprising ways. Human circuits powered by cosmic energy. Any 4 of you could neutralize a mid-size air force. And that's where the recognition is kind of like Doom talking about them like they're some kind of a weapon. But notice this, it's kind of the nature of the UFOs, right? Vapor, different things like that. Basically an attempt to recreate the Fantastic Four, but with a different set of powers. And so that's when you jump to the conversation between Doom and Tony, where Doom talks about the information that he's learned. And he says, listen to me, Tony, right? Reed Richards, in our universe, that man became Doom. Essentially, he became me. In another, he became Mr. Fantastic. But in a third reality, he became the Maker. It was me, right? It was me all along. And that's what Doom didn't know. Doom didn't know who the Maker was. The Maker never revealed his identity to Reed Richards in the Earth 6160 universe when he was screwing him up after the failure of the Fantastic Four and turning him into Doom. And so while the flashback shows him visiting the graves of Susan and Johnny, and where the Project 4 perspective perspective, just shows the group training and kind of failing a little bit, right? The conversation with Tony has Doom asking the question, for an eternity, I wondered, why? Why the torture, the cruelty, the glee? Why was it me? It could have been anybody. Why did he torture me? And it just kind of has this flashback moment where the Maker is literally torturing Reed Richards and laughing about it the entire time. He's finding excitement and joy in all of this. And that's the important thing, right? The Dr. Doom had for the longest time felt incomplete, that something was missing from his own mind. And when he read the Maker's files, he finally saw the shape of this absence. He realized what it was that he was missing. And so that's why he tells Tony, he says, I have seen the enemy, and it is me. Under the circumstances, I am stepping back. And Tony asks, like, what are you talking about, right? Like, what do you mean you're stepping back? And in reality, it's basically Dr. Doom walking away. Because when you get to this flashback with the Maker, right, Reed just kind of recognizes and believes that for a moment, he was dead. And the Maker says, you were, right? We took a step back in time. And Reed just says, right, it was over. I died. Like, it was finally over. The torture was done. And the Maker tells him, it's never over, Doom, not for you, right? You will die 1,000,000 times if it amuses me. You'll die until it doesn't. But do not worry, I am working on something much worse than death. And that's the crazy thing about it, right? This revelation is huge because all we had known up to this point was that the Maker had shown up in this universe, he had screwed with the calculations of Reed Richards in this universe, basically sabotaged the mission of the Fantastic Four. Everybody but Reed died, and then he started torturing Reed. But it seemed more like mental conditioning, right? Telling him, everywhere you go, Doom follows, right? Forcing him to say that his name is Doom, performing some kind of brain surgery on him. And for the most part, it was just kind of assumed that it was part of the mental reconditioning, although we actually find out it was far more nefarious than that. But now we're learning that what the Maker was doing is he was systematically killing Reed and then rewinding time so that Reed would remember dying, but would always come back remembering how he died. It's psychological torture in the worst way. It's absolutely insane, and one of the most depraved things that I think I've ever heard of a villain doing. And so that's why when he's talking to Tony, he says, don't you understand? Every plan, every insight, every breakthrough, he had them first. Any hope we had just went up in flames. All of our preparation, all we've sacrificed, all compromised because I am compromised. And Tony simply just says, yeah, but like, I already knew that. And that's when you jump back to the surgery that the Maker was performing on Doom. And he says, my God, the filth in here. How can you stand the inside of your own head? I can hardly see. And then he says, there it is, right? The thing he was looking for. He says, I'd recognize it anywhere, though it is quite a bit smaller than mine. And so that's when you jump to Project 4, and you actually have Doom, who almost kind of seems a little heartless in doing so, subjecting these various members to the experiment, right? To exposure to cosmic rays, even after they chose to do it. And where one of them is begging for him to stop, he simply just says, just a moment longer. And the irony of this is not lost, right? Certainly not on you, and definitely not on me, right? That the reality here is the Maker was doing what he was doing to Doom because it brought him satisfaction. Doom is doing what he's doing because he believes that the ends justify the means, despite the fact that he gave them a choice. And so it shows the fact that while he truly believes that he is in some capacity the Maker, because the Maker is just an alternate version of himself, the reality is that he's not. That yes, he is inflicting pain on someone, but he's inflicting pain on a person who accepted that pain and understood what it was that they were getting into. And so that's when you switch back to the conversation between Doom and Tony, because Doom asks him, how did you know, right? And Tony says from this conversation, I saw it months ago, though I really do forget how it ends. And Doom asks him, right, like, you used time travel, you saw this, and you said nothing. And Tony's just like, I mean, I guess I didn't? Well, it really just didn't seem relevant. I mean, what does it change, right? And that's where you jump back to the Maker surgery on Doom, and you find out what it was that he removed, because he's holding this little bit of brain in his hand, and he says, now there's a change for the better. The extraction was a complete success. This little bit of gray matter was the troublemaker. And that's where Doom is just like, what are you talking about, right? What did you take from me? Not only that, while we do end up learning that over time, basically years that's passing, that the UFOs, or this new Fantastic Four team, become far more capable as time goes on, that in in the conversation between Doom and Tony, Doom says it changes everything, right? He knows me better than I know myself. It's hopeless, Tony. It always was. I was a fool to think otherwise, even for a moment. And that's where the Maker explains what it was that he took from Doom. He says, you know that feeling that you get when you unlock some secret of the universe, formulate a fundamental law, or discover a new dimension? That profound euphoric moment when everything suddenly clicks into place. It's the best feeling in the world. Isn't it right? You can be honest with me, Doom. I already know how you feel. Not even love comes close, at least not for you. You love science above all else. And he says, that's what I cut out. That feeling, or at least your capacity to feel it anyway. And so Doom can no longer be excited over scientific achievement, that there's no real drive for him to push the envelope and be anything better than what he is. And in fact, where Doom and the UFOs do successfully manage to sabotage one of the Maker's facilities, that in his conversation with Tony, he says one cannot escape one's Maker any more than one can escape one's self. And when the Maker is talking to Doom, he says, be happy I left you your genius. I was not so generous with others. I find myself in need of an assistant, Doom. You're going to help make a better world. And Doom just simply says, my name is Reed Richards, and I will never assist you. And so that went into the experiment of the Maker, where he basically psychologically conditioned Reed to believe he's Doom, changing his physical appearance, the whole 9 yards. It's why he wears the mask. So it's kind of the beginning, right? The set of events that lead up to that origin, as twisted as it is. And so that's where he seemingly addresses Tony Stark, Project 4, all of these guys. And he says, I will make a better world in this one's place, even if there is no place for me in it. And so where Doom is talking to Tony, Tony simply says, I have to go, right? No matter how many of myself that I create, it never seems to be enough. Those teenagers killed me, right? Now, I cannot force you to stay, Doom. The Ultimates is, by design, a choice. I'll simply just say that this might not work with you, but it definitely does not work without you. And so again, that's when you jump to another flashback with the Maker, where once the surgery is complete, Doom is basically turned into an assistant, right? Just doing grunt work around the office, particularly cleaning the entire lab, which seems to stretch on into infinity. And in fact, with regards to these white silhouettes that Dr. Doom sees kind of following him around, he actually addresses them here, right, in this moment. And he says, I know what you think, right? You think that I'm giving up on you, on us. And that's when Hank Pym shows up to visit him, because this conversation between the two of them becomes something incredible. And honestly, I don't think I've ever loved Hank Pym in the Ultimate Universe more than I love him in this part of the story. Because where he talks to the silhouettes, at least Doom does, right? And he tells them, right, I'm trying, I swear, right, I would do anything to be with you. The whole idea behind them and why Doom sees them comes through his conversation with Hank Pym. Because at that point, the narrative starts to shift between Dr. Doom addressing his silhouettes and Dr. Doom talking to Hank Pym. Of course, the conversation with Pym being in the here and now. But when he's talking to the silhouettes, he says, we all have to face reality. All my efforts to break through the barrier around the past and prevent your and our circumstances, all my efforts have failed. And now the Immortus Engine is the only thing keeping Tony Stark alive. Even if I could build another in time, Steve Rogers was right. I would only continue to fail. And while you do get this brief moment where he's experimenting with the cosmic radiation machine, right? And there's this kind of warning, maximum safe threshold exceeded, exposure fatal. That's going to become important here, right? Because when he starts talking to Pym, he says, I am considering leaving the Ultimates. And Pym just says, right, I consider that about 100 times a day. And Doom simply says, right, I am not stable and I cannot be trusted. And so Hank Pym says, I had pretty much the same thought back when I had my little revelation. And he says, you know what Captain America told me? He says, his failures are not your failures. His sins are not yours. And of course, Steve Rogers was right as always. And he says, you decide who you're going to be, Doom. And so in this conversation with these silhouettes, right, he says, yes, I have failed, but I have not given up, right? Given up on the idea of being with them. He says, there is another way for us to be together, all of us. I just need time. And so jumping back to this conversation with Pym, he says the latest revelation of basically the Maker being an alternate reality version of me is only a part of the problem. He says, I am not well. There are times that I feel figures close to me, looking over my shoulder, like ghosts, not presences or absences, the shape of loss. I feel them now. And so Hank Pym asks him, right? He's like, ghosts. I see those sometimes. Only for me, it's the guy I was before the accident. I don't think that they ever really go away. I think they just kind of follow you around forever. It used to really bother me, this thing that I couldn't shake. And then one day I had this thought, and I felt better ever since. Just because you're broken does not mean that you need to be fixed, which is a beautiful statement and incredibly profound, because I think that oftentimes, especially for someone like Dr. Doom, he latches on to the person he used to be, right? I used to be Reed Richards, and my life could have looked like this. And because that's the thing that he's always trying to get to, anything other than that is abnormal, broken, twisted, and it needs to be fixed. But who's to say that it does? We as human beings are a constant work in progress. And so just because right now you're not who you were 10 years ago, and you're not who you imagined yourself becoming, does not mean that you're some broken version of yourself. It simply just means you're not what you imagine. And that's it. That's really all it is. And so with Project 4 essentially complete, right, weeding out everybody that he may simply say are the failures, right, the ones that didn't make the cut, we're finally down to the final 4 members of the team, which he refers to as the Fantastic Force, which is an awesome throwback to the Psylord days. For those of you guys who don't know, there was basically a point in time when Nathaniel Richards, the father of Reed, ended up going back in time and forming a new team to deal with Hyperstorm, the son of Franklin Richards, by bringing Franklin as a teenager onto a team called Fantastic Force, and in fact, in a lot of ways taught Franklin how to use his powers, so it's cool to take that concept and adapt it to the new Ultimate Universe. But nonetheless, switching over to the conversation between Hank Pym and Dr. Doom, that Hank Pym is just kind of like, hey, like, the mice stopped dying, and Doom just simply says yes. And so Hank asks him, right, what are you going to do with them now? And he simply just says, when the mice stop dying, the Fantastic Four will return. And that's where you get to the saddest part of this entire story, because in addressing these ghosts, the specters of the Fantastic Four, he says, I will have my revenge on the Maker, and then I will come to you, my family. In death, we will be together again. We will be free. Doom intends to end himself. Once the Maker's defeated, he intends to bring his own existence to an end and join his Fantastic Four in death, because he knows that his family can never come back. It's the only way he can be with them. And so it's so sad to see him resigning himself to this fate, as opposed to living a life in honor of the Fantastic Four. It's a very sad story, kind of a tearjerker. So, with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.